Hello and welcome to this Apex Hours session on the top 10 anti-patterns on the Salesforce platform. My name is Lars Malmqvist. I'm a certified technical architect and a 32 times Salesforce certified professional. I am also the author of a book on Salesforce Anti-Patterns and another book on architecting AI solutions on Salesforce, both from Pact Publishing. And my day job is as a partner in the management consulting firm Implement Consulting Group, where I work with large Salesforce implementations across the Nordics. Now, today we're going to cover some topics related to anti-patterns. So first we're going to learn what anti-patterns are. Then we're going to dive straight into the top 10 Salesforce anti-patterns based on the feedback that I've been getting from people who've read the book or seen the other content that I've been creating around this. And then we will finish up with some reflections on how you can apply anti-patterns thinking in your day job to improve your architecture practice. So hang on tight. It's going to be a packed session information-wise. So what exactly is an anti-pattern? An anti-pattern is a decision that might seem like it's a good idea at the time you make it, but reliably leads to bad outcomes. So in that way, it's different from bad practice. So an anti-pattern can appear quite convincing, especially when you're under a lot of pressure and you're at a later stage in the project. And in essence, an anti-pattern can feel like the right decision, but over time, it leads to negative results. So it's important to understand that anti-patterns, they exist in various forms. They can be related to communication, code, even project management. And during this webinar, we'll discuss some of the most common and impactful Salesforce anti-patterns and how they hinder your project's performance. So by understanding how these anti-patterns work, you'll be better equipped to recognize the potential issues and make better decisions for your Salesforce projects. So, as we proceed through the session, we'll explore the top 10 Salesforce anti-patterns and discuss, the events that contribute to their occurrence. We'll also delve into the consequences of what happens when these anti-patterns occur, and provide some suggestions for how you can overcome them or avoid them in the first place. So by the end of this recording, you should have a good arsenal of knowledge that will help you steer clear of these common Salesforce anti-patterns and ensure that you have a smoother experience in your Salesforce projects. So hang on. Let's dive straight into our first anti-pattern, number 10, Stovepipe. The Stovepipe anti-pattern occurs when a system is built in isolation without any attention to wider concerns, standards, or requirements. So that can happen when you have an organization with highly siloed departments or when you lack any kind of central architecture governance or development standards. So it can seem like a really good solution in the short term, because if you're an ambitious manager and you need a new IT system, this approach will get you something quickly, right? You don't have to contend with a lot of constraints. However, as you start to scale and you start to need multiple users of the same platform, and let's be honest, for Salesforce, that's almost always the case, then this approach leads to increased complexity, higher cost of change, and difficulty with collaborating across different boundaries. So, the Stovepipe anti-pattern aims to solve the coordination problems that inevitably occur within organizations by building a system in isolation so that we just bypass all of the corporate bureaucracy and any standards for tools and similar, right? So we probably get an IT system pretty quickly. It probably generates value locally in the department where it is being developed. However, it leads to really unfortunate long-term consequences. So over time, Stovepipe systems will manifest a number of issues, such as, a hard to understand code base, right? Because you've got multiple approaches, and no consistency. You've got also architectural inconsistencies in different patterns being applied across the different parts of the overall platform, and different prioritization of architectural concerns, which causes, various conflicts. You can also often see a decline in the quality of the user experience because different parts don't really work well together. You can see an inability to extend the system to new use cases. You could start facing integration challenges, increasing error rates, and certainly you will be facing a higher cost of change. So these issues, they stem from the lack of common standards, practices, patterns, and tools. So, this kind of inconsistency, it means that you are increasing the cognitive load on the technical team by quite a lot. So the system becomes a lot harder to understand and maintain, especially when you start bringing new people into the mix. So what should we do instead, right? Well, we should, of course, focus on a number of strategies. That would include defining clear architectural patterns and practices up front, establishing sort of coding and implementation conventions, adopting technical standards, providing guidance for stable interfaces that can be used for integrations, having a common methodology for how you run your Salesforce projects, have good tooling throughout the development lifecycle, so you don't have to do a lot of things manually. And you have then to have the governance mechanisms to actually enforce this, right? So none of that is simple, but it does mean that you can have multiple teams building effectively on the same platform without ending up with a unmaintainable system in the end. So while a stovepipe can seem like a shortcut to resolve issues around implementing an IT problem, it always leads to significant problems in the long run. So understanding this anti-pattern and taking measures like establishing well-defined standards and methodologies, we can ensure that the Salesforce platform that we're using remains valuable and maintainable and extensible, also in the long term. So that's the stovepipe. Anti-pattern number 9, cognitive overload. Cognitive overload occurs when you present so much information that it becomes overwhelming to the audience to the extent that it impairs action. So that often happens when technical architects try to give a full and detailed account of their reasoning, aiming to create a persuasive and intellectually honest argument, but instead just causing confusion. So, for instance, let's imagine that you're trying to get funding for a change to the integration landscape. You go in, you make a very detailed pitch where you present the detailed reasoning for your changes. However, nobody on the executive board that should grant you the funding have any understanding of what you're trying to say, and therefore they don't approve it. They simply switch off because of cognitive overload. So usually this happens because technical experts like to showcase their expertise. They want to show that they've done the analysis, that they've covered all the angles, and they want to be intellectually honest about the pros and cons. However, in doing so, they end up proposing too much information, and the audience switches off. And that's fair enough, right? They don't have the background, and there is only so much information you can process at a given time. So trying to keep all of these threads in your head when you don't have the background really isn't possible. That obviously results in perfectly good business cases and improvements being rejected because their value isn't really understood. And that obviously is not optimal in the long run. So what should we do to better structure our presentations to avoid cognitive overload? Well, here are some tips, right? So structure the message for the audience and their level of understanding. So, what do they need to know and what knowledge do they have already? Don't assume that people are familiar with the subject matter unless you've confirmed it in advance. So second, focus on a single main message. Don't dilute your point with a lot of things on the side or extra detail. Just keep your focus on the core message that you want to convey. Don't include all of the additional options, right? You may have considered 10 options before you gave your recommendation. Don't present all 10. Present one, maybe present a second one if they're expecting to see multiple options. I know it's tempting to show like how thoroughly you have explored the topic, but you end up creating confusion in your audience rather than helping your case. Use visual aids. So if you can, use diagrams, graphics, tables, images to help convey the message and make it more digestible. And finally, do prepare backup material. So, if you have a lot of material, put some in the appendix. You can pull it up if anybody wants to dig deeper, but don't incorporate it into the main presentation. Just because you've got more stuff doesn't mean you should present more stuff. So, the cognitive overload anti-pattern can lead to significant issues in communication and decision-making. So, to avoid it, focus on simplifying your message, adjusting it to your audience, and only providing the necessary information. Remember, your audience has limited time and attention, and it's vital to make the most use of it. So with these tips in mind, you will be better able to handle complex information presentations and avoid the cognitive overload anti-pattern. Anti-pattern number 8. Assumption-driven customization. This is an anti-pattern that occurs when you take a small and unrepresentative group of stakeholders or experts and use them to drive the customization of a product or project based on whatever they assume to be the right case, but ultimately falling short of the needs of the wider user base. So, for instance, imagine that we're doing a medical app or monitoring some chronic illnesses, and we're going to roll that out on Health Cloud to a bunch of nurses working in clinics that are related to our main company. So the application is designed for tablet devices and has an optimized interface for working on a tablet. However, it turns out that actually the nurses, by and large, don't want to work with tablets when they're with patients. They think it's disruptive. Instead, they like to take all of the paperwork home in the evening and then type it on a nice PC. Here we have an example of an assumption that's been made by a product owner or similar. It turns out to not fit the user base at all, and that does happen quite frequently. Obviously not considering various accessibility requirements usually also falls into this category. We assume that all our users have certain characteristics, and then it turns out that they don't, and then we fail to actually meet the needs of our audience. So the underlying problem with assumption-driven customization is not the specific issues, right? It's rather the method and the source of addressing the issues. So instead of truly understanding the needs and preferences of our users, product owners and developers rely on their own expertise and the opinions of a narrow group to drive all decision-making. And that can often lead to a solution that just doesn't meet the requirements of the broader user base, regardless of how good the intentions of that small group initially was. So effectively, assumption-driven customization proposes that a small representative group can stand in for the whole. And that might be true. Sometimes that's true. But a lot of the time, that fails to reflect the complex, diverse requirements of a heterogeneous user base. So, relying too much on expert opinion can actually backfire, especially if those experts are out of touch with the day-to-day realities. Like often you rely on somebody who used to be in a certain role, but that might have been 5 years ago and reality might have changed. So the consequences are obviously very situation specific, right? It can be, sometimes it's just some small misunderstandings that you can do a couple of change requests and then it's fine. But in the worst case scenario, you actually build something that's just not fit for purpose, and you so have to go back to the drawing board. And I have seen that once or twice where you've got a product that's been, technically well executed, but it simply doesn't meet the needs because you haven't got the feedback from the user base really incorporated at an early enough stage. So to avoid this anti-pattern, you can use a few strategies. So one, you can really encourage broader consultation with the user base. You can do that at regular events during the development project. You can have an online forum, obviously send out various change communication videos. And I mean, seek user feedback early in the development process, maybe do a roadshow or some demos or some webinars. And then you can use those to adjust the product direction. You can also include a larger, more representative group in end of sprint testing. It's a little bit more expensive and may slow you down a little bit, but it can be quite useful in making sure that you're aligned. And then, start thinking about the change management aspects of what you're doing upfront, rather than just leaving it to the end and saying, we're going to build this thing and then we're going to roll it out. That can be very dangerous. Like, engage early, plan change management activities early, make sure that you know how your product is going to actually be adopted by the user base, not just how you're going to build it. So, in conclusion, assumption-driven customization is a perilous anti-pattern, right? It can lead to a product failing if it doesn't resonate sufficiently with users or meet their needs. So, it is worth investing some time and effort into getting more diverse user feedback, doing more regular user testing, and continually reassessing the product direction to avoid falling into this kind of trap. That brings us to anti-pattern number 7, another communications anti-pattern called Groundhog Day. So this anti-pattern arises when people seem to be asking the same questions over and over again, even after you've given them multiple explanations. And usually this situation arises not because you haven't explained yourself well enough, but because there are underlying issues that are not being adequately addressed or acknowledged. So, if you've ever found yourself in a situation where you're trying to roll a product out or get feedback or requirements from a user group, and you just feel like you're banging your head against the wall. Every time you try to explain something, they come up with more questions, and it seems like you've answered the same thing 30 times. You're probably finding yourself in the Groundhog Day anti-pattern. So the problem that the Groundhog Day anti-pattern tries to address is the difficulty of getting a message across. And it proposes a solution of just, keep on hammering at it. Like, keep explaining yourself and explaining yourself and explaining yourself. And often that simply isn't going to work. What you're dealing with is actually resistance, right? You're dealing with some kind of resistance to the problem. And if you're dealing with resistance, then the real solution lies in engaging with the reasons behind these questions rather than addressing the questions themselves. Because, the surface questions are just a manifestation of a deeper issue. So how can you start to deal with that? Well, start by taking a step back, right? Engage with the stakeholders, find some allies who might help you understand them better, and start understanding the real reasons why there is this resistance. Then when you figured this out, see if you can tweak your approach, either, on the functional level, but more likely simply by addressing the real concerns and communicating better to those concerns. So it's really about finding a way of incorporating good change management practice so that you can drive the necessary transformation. And if you don't, obviously there can be really negative consequences, right? You're just going to have to force your way through. You'll face resistance the whole way. The user base is going to get frustrated. The project team is going to get frustrated. You're going to get really frustrated. And that will sort of slow the project down immensely and can even stall it for extended periods of time. So, some good tips for overcoming the Groundhog Day anti-pattern. 1, recognize that the problem exists and is not merely finding a better way to say what you've already said. Take a step back and consider what the situation might be. Engage with stakeholders, engage with people who might help you understand, and figure out what the real reasons are. Then work with these different groups to figure out what is the alternative approach that will actually allow us to move forward. So, in conclusion, being aware of the Groundhog Day anti-pattern can improve your communication effectiveness on Salesforce projects. Like, when you figure out that this anti-pattern is at play, you can then engage better with the audience and address their underlying concerns so that you can move your project forward. You can't always give people what you want, but you can at least get to a point where they feel that their real concerns are acknowledged and that their feedback is really genuinely considered, not just something that you're trying to find a way of dismissing. Sometimes that's enough, sometimes it's not, but at least you will be dealing with the real issue, not trying to play whack-a-mole with people asking the same question 50 times. So that's the Groundhog Day anti-pattern. That brings us to anti-pattern number 6, spaghetti sharing model. That is the first anti-pattern we've had, which is unique to Salesforce. And it's an anti-pattern that emerges when your sharing model becomes overly complex and difficult to manage. So in Salesforce, we've got a very large number of different sharing mechanisms. And organizations, they want to have flexible sharing structures, and they have complex requirements that have to address things like competition law, privacy, cross-divisional boundaries, and all of these things have to be addressed, often in very specific ways. And it is quite tempting to address these issues just, using whatever sharing mechanism seems best at the moment, and then incrementally build and adjust over time. And I mean, the reason why this seems tempting is because in a lot of cases, that's exactly what we want to do, right? With most functionality, we want to start small, then we want to adapt and evolve and build. And, that's what Agile tells us to do. However, specifically for sharing models, that can mean that we end up with a sharing model that is incredibly complex, with so many different interconnected components that it can be hard to understand even for the people who've actually created it. So that leads to situations where record sharing is inconsistent, and you actually can't figure out why a record is or isn't shared to a given user without doing like real investigation. So what can we do to overcome these challenges and avoid falling into the anti-pattern? Well, we have to recognize that the sharing model is a little bit special, and our normal incremental approach may not work. So we actually do have to do some robust upfront design for the sharing architecture, which might involve introducing some principles like, we want to employ a minimum number of sharing mechanisms. We favor some sharing mechanisms over others. And whenever somebody wants to do something particularly complex or use a different kind of sharing, it has to be approved by an architecture review board or a design authority or something like that. So that's, a way to start. Doing that will give you a strong foundation for your Salesforce platform and also allow you to keep your sharing under control even as your use of the platform goes. And I do want to stress that relatively strict governance over changes to the sharing model can really help additional complexity from sneaking in. And that also means that you don't end up with this situation where you can't understand why things are shared. And it's really dangerous, right? It's really dangerous to share information that shouldn't be shared. Like when when you're too restrictive, it's annoying, but when you share something that shouldn't be shared, it can be really bad. So you also need to really invest in some good training and education for anybody who manages the sharing model. So they really need to understand what they're doing. They need to be guided by practices, and they need to know how to make informed decisions about the sharing process and how to push back on stakeholders that are trying to do things that aren't going to be viable in the long term. So the spaghetti sharing model anti-pattern presents a significant challenge because it often emerges from a well-intentioned attempt at accommodating complex sharing requirements into a Salesforce org. And by adopting a more deliberate and organized approach to sharing architecture, and having these governance measures in place, you can avoid falling into the anti-pattern, and you can make sure that your Salesforce environment doesn't go out of control. And that brings us into the top 5. Anti-pattern number 5, Piism. Now, Piism is effectively the belief that you can, in fact, eat your pie and have it too. So, in Salesforce project terms, that means that you are failing to make difficult trade-offs during the implementation process for a variety of reasons. So a common example would be, we've got a bunch of business units. They each have their own line of business processes. They do things in very different ways. And we have a global IT department that wants to create a standardized system across all of the divisions. And they're trying to force that through. And instead of actually making a decision on this global versus local trade-off, you kind of fudge it and you say, yeah, it's a global system, but yes, we will also accommodate the local requirements. And what you end up with is a system that fails to do both. That's unfortunately quite typical. So, Piism tries to avoid the problem of having to make crucial trade-offs by not making them, right? However, most engineering problems, and especially problems in software architecture, they are specifically about balancing trade-offs between different factors. And those trade-offs are often uncomfortable, and you can't please everyone at the same time. So, believing that you don't have to is often an attractive option because, especially in political organizations, or if you've got a relatively weak project leadership and you don't have a lot of senior support, then you can just kind of push the problem out of the way. You can push the decisions down the line, and you can hope that they somehow go away on their own, or that'll be someone else's problem. Sometimes this is done more or less intentionally, and sometimes it's just the compromise that emerges from not being able to find a solution. But the negative consequences from going down this road, they are quite substantial, right? So not making a trade-off doesn't make it go away, right? It just means that you're going to actually experience the conflict, right? So whether that is on the technical level, where you start seeing different parts of the system like competing with each other, or effectively, different teams trying to work across purposes, or just a system that's really unwieldy because you have to handle so many special cases, or whatever it might be. The end result tends to be that you have an unwieldy system with quite a long implementation and low user adoption, right? So you don't meet the needs of your users. Not any of them, right? You're trying to handle all stakeholder concerns, and you end up not really meeting anyone's concerns. So to avoid falling into this trap, you have to acknowledge trade-offs, right? You have to be open and honest and constructively engage with stakeholders about the options. And there are often options of giving people more of what they want, maybe at an additional cost or a longer timeline, but there are often ways around it. There's never a perfect solution that satisfies everyone at once. That's almost never the case in software architecture. But you can come up with a solution that satisfies enough of the requirements of enough stakeholders that it will work. So that is the Piism scenario, and that brings us to our next antipattern. Number 4, automation bonanza. This is a disturbingly common antipattern on the Salesforce platform, and often also an antipattern that is unique to Salesforce, or at least almost unique to Salesforce. And it arises when there is a lack of governance about how automations are used on key objects in your Salesforce org. So it is essential to understand this antipattern and learn how to avoid it if you want to have a performant and maintainable Salesforce implementation. So typically, this antipattern occurs when you need to accommodate different architectural styles or preferences for automation. So some people prefer triggers, some people prefer flows, some people prefer different trigger frameworks than other people, some people prefer different ways of organizing flows than other people. And that can also lead to a number of conflicts. And obviously, there are other automation mechanisms. Sometimes you do things asynchronously with an integration or with a batch job, and that also needs to be taken into account. Or there may be things happening in code when you click a button or similar, and all of these things, sort of coexist. And what effectively happens is if you don't coordinate these, then on your key records over time, you're going to end up with 20 odd different automations, all doing their own thing, and you will have records that take minutes to save, and you'll have strange failures during record save that might not even be fully replicable. You can have synchronization jobs that randomly break, and just debugging things that touch these objects can become really, really difficult. And all of that is down to the fact that you haven't got control of your automation architecture. So, it might sound like a good idea to let teams choose their own best fit approach, but over time, that can lead to really large problems on the Salesforce platform. So how can we avoid the automation bonanza anti-pattern? Well, I've said this a few times, but good architecture governance, especially around the core objects, is crucial. So, define which types of automation you want to use in your org and for which use cases. There are a lot of people saying you should ideally use one automation type per object. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily go that far. There can be good reasons to use multiple ones, but you need to be very clear on how. You just need to have a very solid framework for it. So, like if you're using flows as your main automation mechanism, then maybe you want to avoid triggers as much as possible and instead go towards using Apex actions when you do need code. But if you're using triggers, then maybe you should just use the kind of trigger framework that allows you to then call out to flows as part of that framework. Something like Apex trigger actions. So obviously, remember that we've got some old automation types like process builder and workflow rules that are being retired, and be sure that that you take those into account and that you move them to other mechanisms over time. Also, do keep batch processes and incoming integrations and any other custom code in mind here as well, because they can also effectively work as automations. So this is all something that needs to be tied together, and you do have to monitor it well in order to ensure that it doesn't spin out of control. So if you have a solid automation architecture in place and you've got governance around it, then all of these automation features we have on Salesforce are a blessing. But if you don't, it can become a real curse, because they will just spin out of control and wreak havoc in your org. So that's Automation Bonanza. So now we're into the top 3. And at number 3, we have the golden hammer. It's not a Salesforce-specific anti-pattern, but it is one that occurs quite frequently in the Salesforce ecosystem. So the golden hammer anti-pattern occurs when you have a tool that might be a perfect solution for certain use cases, but it is then mistakenly assumed to be a perfect solution for all use cases. And that can lead to a broad range of problems, including inefficiency, increased cost, and limited functionality. So for instance, imagine somebody who's just started using OmniStudio, and they have good success implementing it at first, and they build some cool processes, and it works really well. And they fall in love with this tool, and effectively they start building everything in OmniStudio, right? They start replacing even standard record pages with the stuff that they build in OmniStudio. And at some point, it starts breaking down because they're using it for everything. They've got so much stuff to maintain, and for a lot of it, it just wasn't really the right solution to begin with. Not that I'm picking on OmniStudio, it's a fantastic tool, but it's not a fantastic tool for everything. And that's what happens when you have the golden hammer anti-pattern. You have a tool that is usually a really good tool for the use case it's intended for. And because it's a really good tool, it gets this halo. You have the halo effect, and it becomes the solution, the de facto solution for everything. Whether or not it's the right solution to the particular problem, it's assumed to be the right solution because it's worked well in other cases. That clearly is not optimal, right? Because that means you end up with poor fit solutions to a number of problems, because you haven't actually done any analysis of whether it was the right choice or not. You've just gone with the golden hammer. So you have to analyze and evaluate the suitability of a tool to a specific problem or requirement. And you have to do that even if you think that you've got a tool that works really well, because it might turn out that your golden hammer is not a good fit to the particular requirement you're looking at now. So what happens when we then, golden hammer everything? Well, there will be gaps in requirements fulfillment because, the tool wasn't actually the right solution to the requirement. You will have likely increased cost because you will need to do more customization and maintenance to make the tool do things it's not really meant to do. And eventually people will start losing faith in the tool and its capabilities. And then you might have a lot of internal questioning about, well, what are we going to do now? Also, you're locking yourself into a specific tool, and you will have a skill set that you then need to invest really heavily in for the long term. So there are better ways to approach technology adoption. And my general advice is to be quite conservative about adopting new tools and technologies at scale, right? You want to not jump on the bandwagon. You want to test things out gradually, implementing things in smaller projects, getting the learning. And then once you've got the learning and you know where the tool does and does not fit, then you might scale it to larger use cases. That will almost certainly prevent a golden hammer situation, because you will not make a decision about rolling out a tool before you actually know exactly where it does and doesn't fit. So the golden hammer anti-pattern is a pitfall that can lead to costly mistakes and a lot of technical debt. And if you recognize that this can happen and you spot, situations where you might be a little bit too quick in adopting a technology, that will help you avoid serious costs in the future. Your job is to choose the right tool for the right job, not to force a single solution onto every problem you encounter. That brings us to number 2, the big ball of mud. So the big ball of mud is what happens when a system loses all internal structure and coherence and becomes virtually impossible to understand or modify by anyone, sometimes even its original creator. It is effectively the end point of what happens if you don't have any practices or architecture governance or care at all about anti-patterns, right? It is the thing that occurs when you just get things done without worrying about how they get done. So, usually the big ball of mud happens because you've got tight deadlines, you've got a lot of pressure, you have to deliver functionality, you don't have enough resources to do the development and the configuration, and technical discipline and governance, forget about it because we just don't have the time. We just need to get it done today. Usually that's how it happens. And that, that is effectively understandable, but obviously not really productive in the long run, right? So you've got, you might have a stovepipe anti-pattern, which was the first we covered, which is already bad. And from that, we try to do a lot of stuff at the same time, working in parallel with different people. And we don't have proper supervision, we don't have documentation, we don't have good decision-making processes. And, 6 months later, we figure out that nobody understands the system anymore. And effectively, our attempt to just get something done has meant that we can no longer get anything done. So when a system reaches the big ball of mud stage, the result can be catastrophic, right? It is usually an end state. You can't do much with a big ball of mud. It is not refactorable anymore, you could say. Usually the only option is to keep it operational using firefighting, having the few individuals that actually can still understand parts of it, fix the errors that inevitably occurs. And then ultimately, you will then need to figure a way of replatforming that functionality if you want to keep it and evolve it in the future. So that is obviously really bad. And, fundamentally, this comes from a variety of sources, but many remedies can be found in having good technical discipline, good standards, good practices, and good governance. And if you have that and you follow them, then in theory, you should never end up with a big ball of mud, because the kind of short-term decision-making that leads to this kind of structural decohesion of your system would be stopped at an earlier stage, and somebody would flag that we're going down a dangerous path. So more fundamentally, it's essential that you sort of cultivate a culture of technical craftsmanship within your organization. If your team values building things the right way, structuring them the right way, and like looking at a system with good patterns, well-structured code, well-aligned configurations, and they genuinely prefer that to a quick and dirty approach that just gets things done, you will probably be safe from a big ball of mud, because your team simply won't do the kinds of things that's going to lead there. Sometimes quick and dirty is okay, right? If I'm doing something simple for a marketing campaign that's going to live for 30 days, I don't want to spend a lot of time structuring it or putting discipline around it. But for the majority of cases, we have systems that have long-term goals and long-term expectations, and avoiding this big ball of mud scenario is going to be essential to keep that system evolvable over the long term. And that brings us to number 1, the hero anti-pattern. I have to say that almost everyone I've ever talked to who've worked in IT for more than a couple of years can relate to the hero anti-pattern. So the hero anti-pattern occurs when you have individuals that usually have deep knowledge about a particular system, and you rely exclusively on them to solve critical issues and do feature upgrades, effectively by working them to the bone. So if you have ever had a scenario where an individual or a small number of individuals seem to carry the entire burden of a project, that's the hero anti-pattern. And it's important to make a distinction here, right? It's not that something breaks in production, somebody steps up, works really hard over a weekend to fix it. That's an anti-pattern. That's obviously fine, right? That happens, and sometimes we have to step up. However, if that is the only way things ever get done, is that somebody has to step up and work overtime over extended periods of time to keep the system running, to do all the firefighting and to do any upgrades. So if that's just the way we get things done around here, you've got the hero anti-pattern. So it means that you've got heroes going above and beyond their normal responsibility, working long hours, and usually sacrificing their own well-being or work-life balance in the process. And that obviously leads to negative consequences in the long run, right? You have single points of failure, right? These people are being worked to the bone. They're probably going to burn out, and you don't have anyone who can replace them, right? Heroes don't scale. So that means that you only have these small number of people who can actually get anything accomplished. And it obviously also, disempowers and demotivates the rest of the team who can't really, contribute in any meaningful way. And you don't have a good process either, because heroes, they don't have time to do documentation, and they don't have time to do handovers. So effectively, it's a bit of a no-win scenario once you've gotten yourself into a hero anti-pattern. Now, there are, of course, better solutions. They're not always easy to implement, but at a high level, they include focusing on sort of transparent, repeatable, manageable processes rather than a few individuals going above and beyond. So some specific things you can think about is, embracing more of DevOps culture, right? Having smaller incremental releases, doing things in a more granular, agile way, building up multifunctional teams that have a lot more internal collaboration, trying to distribute knowledge consistently, not just at particular points in the project, so that you don't have so much reliance on individuals. Encouraging and rewarding team members, not just for stepping up and putting out a fire, but also for mentoring and developing their colleagues. Obviously having good risk management and governance. We've talked about that a few times. And challenging this belief that you have in a lot of organizations that, the big dramatic wins, they're the ones that count, rather than, just being able to churn out functionality reliably over time. Also, just trying to make the costs of being in this anti-pattern visible, right? You can document all of the technical debt you're accumulating, the risks that you have from relying on a few individuals, and all of the opportunity costs that you have from not being able to scale or repeat your processes and do more exciting things with technology. So the hero anti-pattern, it can appear quite beneficial in the short term, right? Who doesn't love to be a hero, and who doesn't love to see heroes do their thing? But it has really, really negative long-term consequences, both for the heroes and for the organization. So it's important to focus on getting a better process instead of just having more heroes. So then that way you can create a really stable foundation for ongoing success. And that concludes our list of the top 10 anti-patterns. We will now reflect a little bit on how you can incorporate this kind of anti-patterns thinking in your day-to-day work, and then we'll wrap up. So the way that I tend to think about bringing anti-patterns into your everyday architecture practice is using a particular process that I call anti-patterns thinking. So it's a mindset where you continuously assess your Salesforce implementation to spot any kind of signs or smells that may indicate an anti-pattern. And by embracing this mindset, you will be more proactive around identifying and addressing Salesforce anti-patterns before they become entrenched. So we can break that process into 5 main stages: observe, identify, communicate, preempt, and reorient. And keep in mind that this is a continuous and cyclical practice, so you should always be learning, adapting, and improving. But if we take it in turn, right? Observe. That means look very closely at your platform and your teams and how they function. So you want to do this in quite a lot of detail. You want to, try to sit with the different teams. If you're an architect, you're often involved across different teams, so you can sort of get a feeling for how the different areas are going. You want to review logs, do code reviews, get some informal feedback from stakeholders and end users. And all of that is sort of part of a process of just understanding what's going on at the big picture level on your platform. Then when you are starting to sort of get enough observations and you think that there might be something at play, it's important to identify and name the thing that you're seeing, right? Because, saying that I'm worried about something is, it can be vague and it can be difficult to make that case. It's a lot easier if you can say, I think we are moving into an automation Bonanza anti-pattern because I can see that these two teams are using different approaches. Although they say they're kind of using the same, they're not really doing it the same way. And I think that's going to be a problem, right? Being concrete and naming it is really key to being able to communicate it effectively. So that also obviously requires you to familiarize yourself with the common Salesforce anti-patterns and how to recognize them in your system. Now, once you have identified them, you need to communicate in the right way to the right stakeholders. So that's, we've covered a couple of communication anti-patterns in today's session. And it's really important that you share your findings, not just with the people who are working on it right now, but also with the appropriate governance forum and with any sort of management that might have a stake in the overall state of the platform. So that can really help align everyone and make sure that that they're on the same page. So, encourage open dialogue, discussing solutions, preventative measures, and so on. That can really help the process. So once you've got people, on board with the fact that there might be an issue, you need to try to preempt, right? So you need to try to catch the anti-patterns before they become really entrenched in your platform, right? So that may mean making small process changes, providing some additional training, doing a bit of refactoring on a particular component. But whatever the case is, having sort of a concrete sort of task force-like mentality where you go in, you see that there is this problem, and we preempt it before it actually happens. That's definitely better than trying to address it in retrospect. And then 5, reorient. That's really about figuring out, well, what was the root cause of this issue that we've just identified? How can we change our practices, change our training, change our governance in order to make sure that something similar doesn't happen again? And how can we monitor that actually works? So, embracing anti-patterns thinking is, in my view, essential for maintaining a healthy Salesforce environment in the long run. But remember that this is something that you have to do sort of continuously. And there's always room to adapt and improve, sort of to make your organization even better. And that concludes our session for today. You can follow Apex Hours here. I also would like to sort of recommend my book, Salesforce Anti-Patterns, if you want to dive deeper into any of these topics. It's available on Pact or on Amazon, and both in printed and in ebook version. So I hope you've enjoyed the session, and thank you very much for watching.